So again, I'd like to welcome you to today's TechNet webcast. This is 24 Hours of Exchange Server 2007. Today we're on part 3 of this 24-part series with planning installation. My pleasure to introduce today's presenter. We have Harold Wong here with us. Harold is a Senior Technology Specialist on the Microsoft Across America team. So Harold, take it away.
Thank you very much, Janet, and thank you everyone for coming in and joining in with us for part 3 of 24. I want to start off with a big thank you to some of the folks on the back end who are busy answering your questions. We have quite a few today. I've got my teammates Viral, Kevin, Brian, and John Weston who are there, as well as Scott Schnoll from the Exchange Product Group. So we are ready to rock and roll. Your questions will probably be answered on a very quick, snappy response time just because there are quite a few folks today. So thank you all for joining in to help out with questions. And I noticed as I'm looking at the question manager here that there's a lot of folks who are asking about dial-in numbers. And if you just look at the very top of the Q&A list, we've posted it a couple of times now. So if you have to dial in, rather than having to ask all the time, hopefully you can just go up and look at the very first few answers, because we posted it about 7 or 8 times that I saw already myself. And we will get into some more or some real technical stuff today in terms of the server roles, getting into more of what they do, what the responsibilities are, some of the requirements for installing Exchange 2007 from a specific role perspective, and then overall from an AD perspective. So we are really going to start getting into some more meaty content versus the high-level stuff that we did in the first 2 sessions. So hopefully you'll start to be a little bit happier about that based on some of the comments I've seen. I know 24 parts, you have to start basic. If you need to get a hold of me, please notate my contact information over here. I've got my email address written down. Kind of hard to get to, but there's my email address and there's my blog. I have been taking all the Q&A logs, been editing them so that they look nice and neat, and correcting or clarifying any questions to some of the answers and posting it on my blog. I'm usually about a day or 2 behind from the webcast itself to actually posting it on my blog. So I finally got the Q&A log from Wednesdays posted this morning. So go take a look at that, print it, download it, whatever you need to do. And I will do the same for today's webcast and everyone moving forward as well. I do want to let you know ahead of time that today I do need to end and sign off because I have another meeting to go to. I am in the Mountain Time Zone. It is 12:35 for me, and at 1:40, no later than 1:40, I do need to shut down and get to another appointment. So I will save the Q&A log. I will not be able to answer everything and stay online like I normally do, but I will have a copy of that, every question in there, and then I will answer it and post the answers to my blog. So please look for that there. With that, let's go ahead and jump into today's session. What are we going to cover today? Well, we're going to look at all the requirements from an AD perspective, a server perspective. We will also look at the pieces for each individual server role. All right? Now I'm going to bypass the helpful experience slide. Probably we'll talk about the agenda because I always start with the review. And if you look, or if you attended Wednesday's session, right, we covered transport and routing architecture. So let's just take a look at the 6 review questions that actually came up from Wednesday's session. I'm not going to ask you in a poll slide, but I'm going to take just a few minutes and review what we talked about there, right? So when you look at a physical layer of the Exchange topology, you're looking at where mail servers are located, where public folders, how they replicate, how mail is transported. You're looking at all the physical topology pieces in terms of how Exchange is going to be delivering email, how they're going to communicate with each other, where servers are located, how clients communicate, right? The whole coot and caboodle is all part of that in the Exchange topology. When you look at server roles, and on Wednesday we kind of went into the transport piece. So we really did concentrate on edge transport server as well as the hub transport server. And the Edge is one of the roles in Exchange that does not require Active Directory, right? In fact, you do not join that server to your production domain. It can be a member of a domain, but it would be a domain in the DMZ that's used for management of DMZ type servers. Even though it's a member of that AD domain in the DMZ, it still stores all of its information for configuration purposes in Atom, which is stored locally on that server. Right? And then when you look at the logical topologies, that's where you're looking at forest topology. Right? And Exchange 2007 can work in a single forest, a resource forest configuration, cross forest, which means you have more than one forest, each of them having their own Exchange org installed into it. Whereas the resource forest, there's the resource forest which has Exchange installed, but the other forests do not have Exchange. Those have just your regular user object and so on and so forth. So that's why this answer was all of the above. Moving into the administrative model, we now have the role-based administrative model in Exchange 2007, where you separate your role, your administration based on your role within the organization. And then there's the delegation wizard within Exchange 2007 Exchange Management Console to delegate who administers what. When you look at the Edge Transport Server, right, it's going to be very similar to the Hub Transport. However, it is sitting in the DMZ. It is not connected to your AD infrastructure, and it will do things such as transporting messages, routing it to the appropriate hub transport, because the Edge will communicate only to the hub transport internally. It performs your message hygiene, so that's the anti-spam, antivirus, but it's not going to do the compliancy, the policy enforcement like your hub transport does for transport rules, for assigning or setting up ethical firewalls or doing journaling rules and so on. Right? That's not the purpose of the Edge transport. If you look at the SMTP protocol in 2007, we are no longer dependent on the Windows Server SMTP stack. Instead, we've written our own, and that is part of the Exchange Transport Services. So when you look at the list of services, you're going to see Exchange Transport Service, and that's the piece that manages SMTP for Exchange 07. All right? So those are a quick review of what we discussed on Wednesday. So let's go ahead and jump into today's agenda and start with the server roles that exist in Exchange 2007. So if we take a look, let's have this build on out. There are 5 server roles in Exchange 2007. We briefly touched on them over the course of the last few webcasts, but let's kind of dig into these a little bit more, and then I have a slide for each one as well. But starting on the left, if you look at the mailbox role, right, the core thing here is it maintains your mailbox databases, whether it be for private mailboxes or public folder databases. That's the role of the mailbox server. Right? Then the client access is for breaking out the protocol accesses from a client perspective, and that's protocols such as HTTPS, HTTP if you really want. So that's our Outlook Web Access clients, our ActiveSync or Exchange ActiveSync, so your Windows mobile devices, POP3, IMAP4, also Outlook Anywhere. So if you've been using that feature in Exchange 2003, we refer to that as RPC over HTTP, and I always say S, but we've now relabeled that as Outlook Anywhere. Right? That's the access of tunneling our RPC communications through that OWA type interface. So it's secure, but it's bringing up Outlook without having to VPN into the corporate environment. All of those connections to Exchange go through your client access server. And also part of client access are some web services, right, such as the availability, the auto discover piece. When I go to do my calendaring, all of that, or all of those new enhancements that Outlook 2007 can take advantage of, that's built into the client access server role on the back end. When you look at the unified messaging, that's a brand new role to Exchange 2007. and that handles voicemail. It handles inbound fax. I need to make sure we're clear on that. It is inbound and not outbound. With the hub transport, we covered that in some degree already on Wednesday, but that's the routing mechanism. That's the piece that routes mail regardless of whether your mailbox is on the same server as mine or even on the same database on the same server as mine. The hub transport is 100% responsible for moving that message from my outbox into your inbox. And as part of that hub transport is all the routing and policy enforcement pieces. So there's a policy engine that's built into the hub transport. Now those first four roles that I just mentioned here, they can all coexist on the exact same physical server. So if I wanted to, I could have one server that has mailbox, client access, unified messaging, and hub transport all installed on that same box. Or from a scalability, flexibility perspective, I can break those all out into 4 different servers. So I could have one physical server for mailbox, a second physical server for client access, a third for unified messaging, and a fourth for hub transport. And if I choose to do it that way, and I've seen a lot of questions in the Q&A that pertains to licensing, then yes, you need to license each physical server with Exchange if you're going to break it out. So if I install everything on one server, one physical server, I need one Exchange server license. If I break all 4 of these into individual physical servers, I need 4 Exchange licenses. And I can also mix and match between enterprise editions of Exchange and standard editions of Exchange, depending on your needs. Right? The 5th one, which is the edge transport, the furthest one on the right, if you notice, we did signify and even drew the fact that it is sitting within or between 2 block walls. This is sitting in your DMZ. It sits in the edge. It is not part of your corporate network. It is not part of your corporate domain, right? It is not part of your Exchange org. So therefore, this machine must be installed on a separate server. It cannot coexist with any of the first 4 mailbox or first 4 server roles. It must be on a server by itself. And this is SMTP. It handles all inbound SMTP email from the internet, and you're going to use this for all outbound to the internet. And it's there for routing, for filtering, message hygiene. Right? We talked about some of these pieces already on Wednesday. So remember, please, these are 5 different roles. The first 4 can be installed concurrently on the same box. The 5th one must be on a box all by itself. So now if we kind of go into each one independently, because I do have a slide, even though I know I spoke about most of it already. But if I look at the mailbox server role and break that out first, the clients that are using Outlook, they will connect directly to the mailbox server role from a MAPI perspective. And I just realized that I did not correct something here. This piece, that's wrong. Let me just cross that out right there. We don't want that. I thought I had fixed that, and I didn't. So Outlook clients that are on the corporate network that connect for MAPI purposes will go directly to the mailbox server role. Right? It does not go through client access. However, any clients that are doing Outlook anywhere will go through the client access. So if I look at this mailbox server role and I look at the different communications that it has with different entities within my infrastructure, there's of course going to be communication here with my directory services. And those are LDAP-based queries to my global catalog server. Right? And a lot of that happens for lookup, for any time something happens as it relates to communicating with AD, it's going to be an LDAP lookup to your global catalog server, generally speaking, as well as to DNS. So it's going to do DNS lookups as well. Over here for Exchange RPC, this second box on the right is my that's the Hub Transport Server. I know for me, I'm trying to get used to some of these icons here, but that is the Hub Transport Server. And for communications with that, it's going to be Exchange RPC. For other components, this one here on the bottom is my unified messaging server, and that's also going to be Exchange RPC. Client access server, which is the middle or the third one, is also Exchange RPC. But the key here to remember is these different server roles will communicate with mailbox server, and not everything is directly with, for example, should clarify, the mailbox server role, notice that it does have a tie-in to the role, but depending on what's going on, it's not going to be directly with the server. The Hub Transport may come into play as well, depending on what's going on. So I'll get into that more when I actually get into the server slide. But know that there are different aspects of communications that does take place between my mailbox server role, my directory services, my Hub Transport, my client access, and then of course unified messaging if you're using that. So if we take a look then at my client access server role, the majority of customers that I talk to generally are utilizing Outlook Web Access and are utilizing Exchange ActiveSync. Right? Those are the two big ones out there. I don't really see a lot of customers anymore that are using POP or IMAP when they have Exchange in their environment. Right? And part of the Outlook Web Access is also the Outlook Anywhere because it ties into that same interface for the most part. Right? It is tunneling of the RPC or MAPI RPC via the HTTPS protocol. Right? So the client access server role is, or the I like to say client access server role is the one that hosts those front-end connections for those types of clients. Right? When I install the client access server role, I'll get Outlook Web Access. I can configure how Exchange ActiveSync works. POP3 and IMAP4 are not enabled by default, but if you want to turn those on, then by all means turn those on. Your web services are part of the client access server role, as I mentioned on the first slide. And those services that I'm talking about there are your availability service and the auto discover, the two big ones. They are part of client access. Right? That's not built into the mailbox. It's not stored in public folders like we did in Exchange 2003. So we have made a change in how we do different aspects of Exchange nowadays. Let's get into the unified messaging server role here. And if you look at remember this is for voicemail and inbound fax. I want to make sure people understand that this is not outbound. This is only inbound fax. So if I want to receive a fax, so if you look at my scenario, for me, my number is, or phone number is 425-706-3501. If you dial that, you get my voice line. You can leave me a voicemail. If you leave me a voicemail, the unified messaging server does take that message, it records it, does the encoding, and then the Hub Transport server will actually pick it up and deliver it to my mailbox. So in this slide, you don't see the Hub Transport server listed, but it does come into play because it must transfer the message from the unified messaging server when it comes in to my mailbox. Same thing, if you wanted to fax me something, you would go ahead and use 425-706-3501 as my fax number. Right now, I only need to remember one number. And if you need to fax me, it'll come in, unified messaging server will pick up, it'll realize the fax tones, it'll receive the fax, accept it as a TIFF. The Hub Transport will then take that TIFF and deliver it to my mailbox. Now, when I connect in, let's say I am connected to my mailbox server with Outlook, and I get the voicemail, I see it come in or I see the TIFF come in, well then I can play it, I can open it up, I can view it. Right? Also, as part of unified messaging, I can dial in and retrieve my voicemail by dialing in via the phone line. Right? Because historically, if I have voicemail, I dial into some you know, retrieval number. And with that, if I dial in, then that is where the unified messaging server will interact with my mailbox directly to pull the voicemail and read it to me or play it to me over the phone. If I want to start interacting with my mailbox utilizing the auto attendant, Outlook voice access piece, then also the unified messaging server role will come into play to access the mailbox on my behalf and pull that information. It'll read my calendar to me. It'll allow me to do lookups against the corporate GAL and so on and so forth. Right? But that's the unified messaging server role. If you already have a VoIP environment, depending on the one you have, it may just integrate directly with it. If not, and you're saying, well, I don't plan on implementing voice over IP fully in my network yet, but I still want to take advantage of unified messaging, well, then there are voice over IP gateways that you can purchase, and they can integrate with your digital or analog PBX, and you can still take advantage of unified messaging without having to deploy a full-blown voice over IP solution today if you're not already in that environment. And if you look at the Microsoft.com/exchange site, there is a list, there's a link over there with a list of all the different PBXs that we've tested that work with one of the VoIP gateways out there that we've worked with as well. So take a look. That list is getting updated on a regular basis, and that list is quite long now, right? There's a lot of PBXs that have been fully identified, as well as voice over IP systems that have been identified to just work directly with or with maybe a few modifications. But either way, go take a look at our website to get more of those details. So if we go into the next piece, which is the hub transport role, well, we've kind of gone into this on Wednesday in pretty good detail, but I do want to point out a few more things, right, because there's always something else to talk about. The hub transport role is responsible, as I said earlier, for routing messages. And it doesn't matter whether the message was delivered or our mailboxes sit on the same server, on the same database. It really doesn't matter. It is responsible for all email delivery, right? And it's going to take advantage of 80 sites. So by the way, I forgot to mention, for every 80 site that has a mailbox role, you do need a hub transport role in that site, as well as a client access server role, right? So to have a fully functional Exchange environment, you need at a minimum mailbox, client access, and hub transport. Those are the three you need at a minimum. Unified messaging is totally optional, as is edge transport. But if you ask me for my personal opinion, I would not have edge as optional. I would always find a way to implement that in my DMZ because it gives me great benefits. But once again, that's my personal opinion, and that is a best practice. So sorry about that sidetrack, but I totally forgot to mention that. And then in addition to routing of messages, it's also there for message policy and compliance. So the policy engine is built right into the hub transport. And if you choose not to implement the edge transport, or the edge transport server, then you can also turn on the anti-spam agents and install those agents onto the hub transport server and have the anti-spam capability built in there as well. You do have to run a script to get that done, but you can install those, and you can configure the IMF components and so on and so forth. And then antivirus is not something that's built into Exchange. Right? You don't get antivirus as a core engine or a core component of Exchange. You do still have to install that separately. We, Microsoft, do have an antivirus solution for Exchange, and it's called Forefront Security for Exchange. But it is still a separate install. So when you go and get your copy of Exchange Server on the DVD, I believe it should ship on a DVD now, you will see a directory in there called Forefront. And in that directory, you will actually have the full bits of Forefront that you can install. However, do understand that we do charge for licensing on that as well. So if you just install it as is, it will be an evaluation copy, but you do get it. And then if you activate it by putting in the appropriate code, then it becomes the full installation of forefront security for Exchange. All right, but it does come on the media, and that way, we give you something to at least get started with, even though you may prefer to use a third-party antivirus vendor. And rather than me trying to speak to when the availability is for each of our partners that have antivirus solutions for Exchange, I will encourage you to go contact the vendor that you are currently using and ask them when their antivirus for Exchange 07 will ship, if it hasn't already shipped. And the same goes for backup. I would encourage you to talk to your vendor, the vendor that you use today, and ask them when they will have a backup solution for Exchange 2007. Because that is not something that we control. It is something that your vendor does control. So ask them, and they should have a good ETA for you, rather than depending on me to get that information for you. All right, so if we move to the next piece, which is the Edge server role, that is sitting in the DMZ. Remember, it is SMTP. It is not a CAS server. It does not handle IMAP. It does not handle OWA. It handles one thing, SMTP traffic. Right? One thing only. So remember, Edge, SMTP. Edge, SMTP. Whoops, hit the wrong key. Let's get this to build. So one of the nice things, though, of using the Edge transport is you can actually synchronize one way via EdgeSync directory information and the safe sender list, the allow list, out to your or out to your Edge transport. So if you look at this diagram here, let me pull out my little drawing tool. This one that I just outlined, that's your Edge transport. That's the one that's sitting inside the DMZ. And then, of course, that means this particular server here on the left is my hub transport server. And if I configure an Edge sync communication channel, I can sync one way out to the Edge transport my recipient information, which is stored in Atom on the Edge transport, as well as my safe sender list. And that way, when emails are getting scanned, let me give you an example. Let's say emails coming in from spam.com, making that up. And it gets tagged as spam by the IMF on that Edge transport. Therefore, it doesn't even come into the organization. Yet, for my job purposes, I want to receive emails from that organization because of what I do, because of my job role. So I go ahead in Outlook, I mark that as safe. Well, if it doesn't sync out to the Edge transport, it never shows up in my inbox. Therefore, it still never shows up as safe because it's being blocked at the Edge. Well, if we turn on the Edge sync and we sync that safe sender list out to the Edge transport, as the Edge transport is actually scanning for spam, it will realize that, hey, Harold has marked this as safe. So I will allow that message to go ahead and flow through to Harold, but to nobody else. Right? And therefore, we have that tight integration, or that benefit, that value add of using the Edge transport in conjunction with my Exchange 2007 internal environment. Right? Just want to point that out because that is, in my opinion, a very important piece. Right? So that does your inbound and your outbound message flow. All the message hygiene can be done there. And then the different Edge transport rules in terms of how messages are routed internally and what messages are allowed. You can strip out attachments, right? So I can actually set up a rule there that says any attachments coming in, I just automatically strip them out, or strip out the .zip files and so on and so forth. Right, so those are the 5 different server roles. So remember, the first 4 I talked about, which is mailbox, client access, hub transport, and unified messaging, can sit on the same server or 4 different servers, or a mix of up to 4 different servers, I guess. And based on how many physical servers you deploy, you may need an additional license. The Edge transport must sit on a server by itself, and it sits in the DMZ, not a part of your domain, although it could be a member of a DMZ type domain, as I mentioned earlier, for management of DMZ-based servers. But it is not going to be part of your production forest, a part of your production Exchange org. So let's go ahead and take a look at our first demo. And I will admit it seems a little weird, but I'm going to go ahead and set up and run through some of the setup here before I actually even start to check for compatibility, right? But just bear with me. Let's go ahead and jump into my first demo here. I do want to make sure that you are able to see my demo machine, which is BVEXDPL1. It is running Windows Server 2003. It is a domain controller, global catalog server, so on and so forth, but it doesn't have anything on there right now. Right? It's a clean machine. In fact, let me just do net start. Take a look, and you'll see that there are no Microsoft Exchange type services at all running on this box currently. All right, so let me go ahead. I'm going to start setup because I can actually run setup here. This is the GUI-based setup. Did I not click it? Let's try this again. There we go. So during the install process, it does actually select or does 3 different steps at the very beginning, which are these 3 here. It's checking for some prereqs, which for me is already done. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to complete or go on to the next step, so made sure I did that first. Let's take a look at this machine. Get the setup running. Click Next. Let's go ahead and read through the EULA. I agree to all of those terms. I'm sure everybody reads just as fast as me, if not faster. It's up to you whether you want to go ahead and, provide feedback. I'll say yes, even though I don't have internet connection. And then when you look at the installation type, I can click a typical installation, or I can choose the custom installation. The typical installation essentially configures my hub transport, client access, and mailbox, along with the management tools, right? The 3 core server roles that are required to have a fully functional Exchange 2007 environment. I can also choose custom installation. So let's walk through this real quick. If you look on this screen, you can see there are 4 roles up here. Edge transport kind of broken off by itself. And then I have an active clustered mailbox role and a passive mailbox clustered role also broken off in a section by itself, along with the management tools. So if I select management tools, because it is a checkbox, notice all the other options are still available, whether I install management tools by itself or not. Now if I select mailbox role, notice right away Edge and the clustered options immediately gray out. I cannot select those. And the same goes for if I select one of the clustered roles, then everything else grays out as well. So let me come back up here and I'll select client. But notice that all of these 4 roles up here, they still stay checkable, because remember I said I can install all 4 of these roles on the exact same server, right? So they can coexist. But if I select any of these, I cannot select Edge. So if I go and select Edge, notice, of course, I cannot select any of the first 4 roles, because Edge must sit on a server by itself. And when I select these roles, depending on the roles I select, it will only install the binaries that are pertinent to the role in question. So if all I want to do is install the hub transport role, I can go ahead and select that. It's going to go ahead and do the tests necessary to make sure that I can actually install this role. So notice right away I'm doing a 32-bit version, which is not supported in production. And I'm going to go ahead and click Install, and we'll see what happens here. It's going to copy files. It'll go ahead and configure things. And provided everything is fine, everything will work, everything will install, and so on and so forth. If I go down, let's see, I probably should switch over to my Exchange 2003 server. I want to show you something. This is my Exchange 2003 server. I have a different set of virtual machines that I brought up. This one has Exchange 2003 installed on it. It's also a domain controller. But let me start up the Best Practice Analyzer tool. I'm going to cancel this check. But if you have your Best Practice Analyzer installed, I would encourage you to run this go ahead and check for updates and install the update so that you actually have the option to scan for, let me show you, we'll get here real quick, my Exchange 2007 readiness check. Right? I want to make sure that I can actually scan my current environment and see, am I ready to install oh 07 into it? Are there anything, any requirements, any specifications, anything that I'm missing that I need to perform prior to installing? And if you look up here, you'll notice that I already actually have 2007 installed in this scenario. But I wanted to point out that you really, really should get your hands on that best practice analyzer if you have not already done so, and go ahead and install and run this readiness check. Let me also then go to my 2007 server that's fully installed, because after you install, let me bring up my management console. If I look, there are the 4 different server roles, because this is not the edge transport, but I can see which ones are installed on this. And this has hub transport, client access, and mailbox. Okay, go away. And if I wanted to configure mailbox, I could go there. If I wanted to configure client access options, I'd go there. And also want to point out that you can go to the command shell and you can perform commandlets or execute commandlets just to verify, right? How is everything configured? If I wanted to see all my Exchange servers, so I wanted to get Exchange server information. And notice I did have tab complete capabilities. So once I start typing, I can go ahead and hit tab, and it'll cycle through all the different commands that have the same starting characters that I initially started to type in. And I can see what servers I have out there. I can also do things such as get mailbox server, and I can see the mailbox server roles that are out there. I can see basic information, such as is it clustered or not. I can pull up information such as get storage group. Let's pull that up just so that I can see all the storage groups that are out there. I can get information around the mailbox database. All right, so let's get mailbox database. Oh, would help if I can type correctly. I can see all the different databases. I can get information about client access. All right, so I can see which client access servers exist within my environment. And right now I only have 1, but if I had 10, regardless of how many AD sites I had and so on and so forth, it would still list all 10 for me. All right, the same thing goes for the transport. All right, I can find out how my transport's configured. Actually, transport server. I can find out which transport servers exist in my environment. Right, the key I'm trying to point out is after you install Exchange, you can go ahead and use commandlets to verify that everything is set up correctly, and you can look at all of that from the commandlet piece. So if I do one more, which is organization config, I can get the entire configuration for my Exchange organization. I can find out Exchange recipient email addresses. I can find out am I in mix mode, blah, blah, blah. So I can see information as it relates to my Exchange organization configuration. Right? And all of that is just right here within Exchange. After you install, you can go ahead and run through some of these different commandlets. Right? I'm not going to get into all of those pieces right now. I mean, I showed you some of those basic ones. And then let's go ahead and take a look. Because after you install Exchange, of course, you're going to want to come in and make sure that your mailbox databases are set up correctly. So if you need to create additional storage groups, create additional mailboxes, then by all means, go ahead and do that. If you want to configure your client access options, then you would go into client access on the server side, and maybe I'm interested in configuring my Outlook Web Access properties. So if I come over here, I can go ahead and configure Outlook Web Access. And I can take a look at the internal URL. I can look at authentication mechanisms I set up. I can take a look at segmentation in terms of what I turn on or turn off for my Outlook Web Access users. I can enable public computer file access as well as private, right, those settings when they select private versus public computers they're using. and whether I turn on document or web-ready document viewing or access to file shares and so on. Right? That entire piece is done from within the client access server role. So if I was looking at hub transport, some of the things that pertain to hub transport, and I did this on Wednesday, came in here and showed you the receive connectors. Right? And this is a hub transport by hub transport configuration. If I wanted to look at organization-wide configuration, and I look at hub transport, that's where I can come in and define my remote domains. I can set up my email address policies. I can take a look at my transport rules, right, the ethical firewalls or whatever it is, adding a disclaimer to all my emails. I can turn on my journaling, and this is where I set up my Edge subscriptions to communicate with an Edge transport server as well. All right, so if I wanted to, let's see, I guess I'd go back to the mailbox. I can also set my properties for a given mailbox server or mailbox database in terms of limits, just like you could before. So things have not changed in that respect. Right? I still have those same similar settings that I had before. Right? Excuse me. Let me go back to my client access. And if you look over here, there was the Outlook Web Access piece. There's an Exchange Active Sync piece. So this allows me to define my Active Sync policies in terms of authentication. Right? Am I going to ignore clients? What are the remote file servers? Oops, wrong click. If I look at my offline address book distribution, I can take a look at where that is and the properties associated with my offline address book. Notice I set my polling interval, and then there's a URL. But it is not stored in public folders, unless, of course, you have interaction with Outlook 2003 and older clients. Right, so Outlook 2007 does not utilize public folders for grabbing of the offline address book or looking up FreeBusy and things like that. Just do want to point that out. So this is information that you would configure, and you would do that from the server configuration client access. There's also different client access policies that you can set up over here from an organization perspective, but then those are associated with Exchange Active Sync, such as password policies. All right, so that's a quick look at actually running through a quick install for Exchange from a GUI perspective. I showed you on, let me go back to that server. Notice that it did complete. If I click Finish, it's going to go ahead and come back up and allow me to go through, going through the install process again or whatever. But the nice thing is I can select the roles that I'm interested in, right? And I'm going to stop that sharing right now. Get back to the slide. Right, I went ahead and showed you that you could select different server roles. You can select a bunch of them at the same time. It all depends on what you select as to what options are available and which ones aren't. It talked about verifying that everything was installed, so I went in and from the command shell, I was able to do some queries to find out which servers had client access on there, which ones had transport, look at the databases that exist, or even from the GUI, right? I went into the GUI and I showed you that my server had the client access, the mailbox, and the hub transport. So I can see that from the GUI as well. I was just trying to show that there are different ways to get at the same information essentially. So let's go ahead and do a quick review of what we just finished talking about. And this one I just talked about when I looked at the demo. But if you're looking at your Exchange 2007 server roles, which one manages the offline address book? And hopefully we'll get a good mix of people actually participating and answering the questions. And so far I'm getting less than 50%, so I'm trying to make sure people are paying attention and that I've made the information clear. Let me show you the results. 69 or 64% now are getting this correct. It is the client access server role, right? It's the CAS that manages that offline address book. So if you remember when I was in the demo, I went to the client access server role, and that's where I saw configuration parameters as it related to offline address book. Right? So please remember that. The answer is the client access server role. If we take a look at the next question, Where does the mailbox server role access recipient server and organization configuration information? Right? Where is it going to pull that information from? This is kind of tricky. Oh, oops, hey, what happened? Polls are now open, so go ahead and vote. I apologize for that. I didn't realize I closed the polls. So where does the mailbox server role grab information about recipient information or the organization information? Where's all of that information being stored? And I also covered some of this on Wednesday and also on Friday, parts 1 and part 2. And it looks like we are getting a higher percentage of the folks getting it correct than we are getting wrong. So it is none of the above. It's not stored in any of these. It's not the client access or the hub transport. It is Active Directory, right? So it's going to pull directory services to get that information. So that's why the answer here is none of the above. So let's go to the third question. And when we look at inbound messages from the internet hitting the edge transport server, who does it hand off to, right? What server role on the inside, on the corporate network from an Exchange perspective, does the edge transport server communicate with? It only communicates with one server, no other server directly, only one. So let me go ahead and show the results. And it looks like by and far, the mass majority of you are getting this correct. Right? It is indeed the hub transport server. The edge transport server is SMTP. It does not communicate with any other server in the organization other than hub transport. It does not go directly to mailbox. It does not go directly to client access or to unified messaging. It passes everything off to the hub transport server role. So very good job there. And let's go ahead then and jump into the final agenda item, which is the planning piece in terms of what is required from an AD perspective, what is required from a server perspective, and so forth. Right? Very important information, because if you're looking to deploy, you need to understand whether your environment is ready for it or not. So the first thing you want to look at is your AD environment. Your schema master must be running Windows Server 2003 with SP1 at a minimum. It could be running R2, because that also includes SP1, right? But it's got to be at least Server 03 SP1, which means your Active Directory is has 2003 domain controllers in it, right? Because otherwise, how can this be a 2003 server? Now, here's the thing. It is up to you whether you want to run 64-bit domain controllers or 32-bit domain controllers, right? There is no requirement that says you must have 64-bit domain controllers. That is not a requirement. It is going to give you better performance, but you are not required to put in 64-bit domain controllers. But the schema master must be Server 2003 with SP1, right? So remember that. You must have a Windows 2000 native domain functional level at a minimum. It could be 2003, but at a minimum it must be Windows 2000 native. You cannot have Exchange 5.5 in your Exchange org. You must not have any, you cannot have any, there's no possibility of it being there, which means your Exchange org must also be Exchange 2000 native, right? It's got to be a native mode Exchange org so that you do not have any of that 5.5 stuff in there. That's one of the checks that setup will perform. DNS, you've got to make sure that your AD environment is set up correctly, DNS is configured correctly, you've got your domain name in there correctly, you've got your FQDN specified correctly, your Exchange, the server that will be your Exchange server is configured correctly, IP is set up correctly, and so on and so forth. Otherwise, if that's not set up correctly, I guarantee you're going to have issues. All right, so please make sure that your entire back-end infrastructure is already working and working correctly. And then go ahead and prepare your schema, right, in terms of extend the schema. Now, I will say this. If you notice what I did in my first installation, I did not have any Exchange installed, but I did not have to actually go in and prep the schema separately. So if it's not done, so long as I'm logged in with the appropriate rights, the setup program will go ahead and do that for me. But if you have a large environment or you have separation of roles, then you can hand off the DVD to your schema admin folks, and they can extend the schema. Right? Whether they run it on their schema master or they run it on another box that can perform the task. And if you don't have 64-bit domain controllers, you can use the 32-bit version, eval version of Exchange 2007 to do the schema extension. Right? That is supported. You just cannot install the binaries and run that in production. All right, so now let's take a look at hardware requirements. All right, and I am talking about production environment, not a test, not a demo, not a training environment, but production. So if you're going to run in a production environment, this is for the server you will install Exchange onto. It must be an x64-bit processor. So that's the Intel Core 2 Duo, the AMD Turion, or it's going to be the 64-bit AMD, the 64-bit Intel. Not the Titanium, by the way. We don't support that. It is going to be the x64 extensions. Right? No ifs, ands, or buts. They can be, and most of them are now dual core, and I'm starting to see quad core processors come out. From a memory perspective, you want a minimum of 2 gigs of RAM, and then if you look at your mailbox stuff, then you're going to want 2 to 5 meg of additional RAM per mailbox that you're hosting. And that's going to depend upon the profile of the mailbox user that's connecting in. Right? But either way, you're going to want to add additional RAM into that machine, plus the page file size, the amount of RAM plus 10 meg. If you look at disk space requirements, you're going to want 1.2 gig, 200 meg of available space on the system drive, and all drives that will be used by Exchange must be NTFS, including the system, including the drive that the binaries will get installed onto, the drive that the mailboxes will be hosted on, and so on. And because this comes in DVD media, you'll want a DVD drive. Or if you're going to install over the network or you copy it somehow locally to the hard drive, so long as you can get the binaries onto that machine so that you can do the setup. Right, so those are the hardware requirements for Exchange 2007. And this is true for every role, right? Whether it's a mailbox, a CAS, hub transport, unified messaging, or edge transport. Yes, they must all be 64-bit machines. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. All right? And we do scale, because it's a 64-bit architecture, you can have 24 gigs of RAM. You can have 32 gigs of RAM. Right? So go ahead and add the memory in, and Exchange will utilize it. From an OS perspective, beyond just the hardware, on that machine you do need Windows Server 2003 SP1 or higher. Personally, I recommend R2, because if you have R2, then the Management Console 3.0 is already there. It's installed automatically. The .NET Framework version 2 is there. You just have to make sure it's installed. It's a checkbox. And then I go ahead and download the PowerShell 1.0 off the internet, install that, and I've got the core requirements. In addition to all of these things, there's also hot fixes and whatnot that you may still need to get post installation of just the core Windows. So if I took the media for Server 03 R2, I installed that, there's still going to be additional hot fixes or patches that I will need to install that Exchange 2007 will require. And the fixes and whatnot that are required is going to be dependent upon the role that you actually install onto that box. Right, so if you look at the CAS role or the Unified Messaging role, because Unified Messaging requires speech server, well, there are going to be additional patches or additional requirements from a media perspective. Right, and I have a slide that, on the next one, in fact, let's just go to it, that talks about what's required for each of these different roles. So let's just build this all out. The first one being the mailbox server role. Right, I do need IIS, need Worldwide Web Service, and do need to enable the network COM plus access. There's a hot fix that is specific to that. And If you don't have it, when you go to run setup, it'll tell you, hey, you need this, here's why, here's where you can go grab that file. For your CAS role, you do need also World Wide Web Services, ASP.NET 2, right, an RPC over HTTP proxy Windows networking component if you're going to enable Outlook Anywhere. From the UM perspective, that's where you need the speech service, the media encoder, the audio codec, right? And there are some hotfixes that are pertinent to each one of these components over here, that if you weren't installing UM, they're not pertinent to the CAS role or the mailbox role. Hub transport and edge transport, do not install SMTP or NNTP. In fact, don't put any of those on any of your Exchange roles. Right? So in the Exchange 2003 environment, everybody got used to automatically ensuring that SMTP and NNTP were installed. Now we're changing from that. Switch away. You don't do that anymore. Right? Make sure those are not installed. And then the edge transport is going to use Atom, and it does not use AD. You can have it a member of a domain, but it will not be your corporate domain. If you look at client requirements, let's build this out. For Outlook Web Access, IE 7, IE 6, that's fine. We also support non-IE browsers, right? So go ahead and take a look at that and see if that experience is pretty good for your user base. I think it rocks compared to what we had in the past for non-IE browsers. For mobile devices, Exchange ActiveSync, so any of the Windows Mobile, Pocket PC 2003, 2nd edition, Windows Mobile 5 with MSFP, as well as the Windows Mobile 6 devices that will probably be out in the next 6 to 8 months. Right? That was codenamed Crossbow. If you look at your Outlook clients, that's POP3 and IMAP 4, any of those will work as well. I haven't seen anything that doesn't work, but then of course I rarely use those anymore, other than for connecting to my ISP, not to Exchange. So just take a look, and also want to point out that officially from an Outlook client support, we support Outlook 2003 and above, which is 2003 and 2007. Preferably 2007 so that you can take advantage of all the new components and features that come with Exchange 2007. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at this second demo, which I've already kind of done, right? Because I kind of thought it was a little stupid that I wouldn't do the pre-check. So let me cancel out of. Oh, by the way, this is showing maintenance mode. So if I come back in, if I wanted to add an additional role, I can go ahead and just say, hey, I want the mailbox role now on the server as well. Click next, and it'll go ahead and install that for me. Right? Let me come over here and go to my Exchange binaries. There's a setup, and if I do setup switch help, it'll give me help on the setup options. And the one I might be interested in is my prepare topology. Whoops, it would help if I could type correctly. So if I wanted to see the different options for preparing topology, that would be the prepare AD or prepare schema, prepare domain. Right? If I do prepare all domains, I do need to make sure that I have the rights, the permissions to run that against every domain in my environment. So something like Enterprise Administrator. Right? But the key here is if I'm preparing schema, I'm implementing the schema extensions. Prepare domain is setting up the local domain with the security objects and the permissions. All right? So there are different switches and options that you can use to do different aspects of the setup. And I did want to just point that out to you. If I go to my 2003 server, I already showed you this piece, which is bringing up the best practice analyzer and making sure that I've done a check, a readiness check, to make sure that everything is indeed there and I don't have anything missing. This does a great job of identifying any gotchas. Right? Also, if I look, right, because I mentioned DNS, so make sure that you verify and make sure DNS is set up correctly and you've got all your zones set up, your forward lookup zones, your pointer records, and so on and so forth. your server is configured appropriately. So if I go to my Exchange 2007 server here and I look at my network settings, right, make sure that I've set up my network, my IP stuff appropriately. With my IP, if I have a default gateway, that I set that correctly. If I look at my advanced, right, there's my DNS settings. Use WINS if you need, but we don't require WINS for Exchange to function, unlike we did for Exchange 2000 and some aspects of 2003, depending on what you were doing. Right. Also, this one's not a domain controller, so let me go back to my domain controller. Also, go ahead and take a look and make sure that your sites and services are set up correctly. And I apologize, I'm running just a few minutes late. Bear with me. Right? Make sure that you've defined your sites, defined your subnets, right? Because Exchange takes advantage of your AD sites and how they're configured. If this is not configured correctly, then Exchange will not operate correctly, right? There might be some challenges there as well. So the key is making sure that your AD environment is set up, that your server environment is set up, all the different patches and hot fixes and different components that you need to install have indeed been installed, right? And personally, like I said, I prefer to use Windows Server 2003 R2 because it has a lot of the different components already there, whether it's installed by default or whether it is a checkbox that I can just select. All right, so let's finish up here with my 3 review questions. The first one is, what is not a prerequisite for installing Exchange 2007? And this is onto the actual box I'm going to install Exchange onto. Right? And if hopefully, it looks like most of you were indeed paying attention. So let's go take a look. 87% of you got it right. It is indeed none of the above. All right? Because you do need .NET Framework 2.0. You do need PowerShell. You do need the Management Console 3. Right? I mentioned that those were, no, clicked on the wrong one. Go back. So it is none of the above. Right? You need all 3 of them. Of course, I just gave away the answer for the next review question. So which of the following is not a prerequisite for client access? Oh, goodness gracious. And if you actually saw the click, you guys all know, and it looks like the majority of you are getting it correct, so let's show the results. It is indeed the Microsoft Speech Service. That is required for UM. It is not required for CAS. So there's the answer there. And then the last question. From an official perspective, which Outlook client is not supported for Exchange Server 2007? Even though technically it will connect. But from an official perspective, which one is not supported with with Exchange 2007? And it looks like most of you are getting that correct. It is indeed Outlook 2000. In fact, Outlook 2000 is kind of fallen off the supported products list, right? We have that 5+5. So because it's not a supported product anymore, we don't officially support it for connectivity pieces to Exchange 07. Like I said, if you actually use it, you'll find that it will still work unless you go in specifically and disallow it. So that brings us to an end of this session where we took a look at the different server roles in a little bit more detail, and then I talked about the requirements, because as you're planning to install Exchange, you need to understand what's required from an AD perspective and from the server perspective that you're going to install Exchange onto. So we walked through that. I showed you the install, and we took a look at how to verify, as well as just some of the prereqs that you can do if you wanted to break them out into different steps. So with that, I do want to thank everyone for taking time today to attend this session, as well as the first 2 if you did attend the first 2. I also want to thank again Brian Von Axelson, Scott Schnoll, Vero Tarpara, Kevin Remdy, and John Weston, who are on the back end answering your questions. I will go ahead and in about 3 to 4 minutes, I'm going to save off the Q&A log, and then I need to shut down and get to another meeting. But look for me to post the Q&A with the answers and everything by probably Monday. Depends on whether my wife will let me do some work this weekend or not. All right, so thank you very much, and have a great weekend wherever you are.
Great. Well, thanks, Harold. And so I'm going to remind everybody, if you have questions, hurry up and get those in the question and answer log right now. And And Harold does get those downloaded on this blog, and that's blogs.technet.com/Harold Wong. You'll be able to find all those questions and their answers there posted there. I'd like to thank those subject matter experts for handling all those questions throughout this presentation. It's nice to get your questions answered, I know, real time, and so I'd like to thank everybody there for being on the back end and being busy answering your questions there. So we'll remain online for just the next few minutes. If you have those questions, get them into the question and answer log, and we'll answer them via the Q&A text window as well as during Harold's blog there. So we do record these webcasts. If you'd like to see any of our previously recorded webcasts, as well as anything that's coming up, everything is posted at Microsoft.com/webcast. We hope to see you back on the 31st here for part 4 of this 24-part series. And if you have content ideas, anything you want to see us do differently, we'd love to hear from you. There is yet another URL there where you can contact us and let us know how you'd like to see us improve these. So today's webcast was presented using the Microsoft Office iMeeting technology. There is a free 14-day trial. Just go to Microsoft.com/present-live. And we have a survey here. I just want to remind you all, if you fill out that survey, not only is your feedback very valuable to us, but you will be entered into a drawing to win this great little Zoom digital media player. So please take a moment, fill out the survey before you log out. We do appreciate that. And you should be seeing that survey now in your slide area. If you hit that little registered online area or all other registrants, that will take you right into our survey. So with that, I'm just going to extend a special thanks to Harold for today's presentation. So thank you so much, Harold, for presenting this third hour of this exchange. And thanks to our subject matter experts, Brian, Scott, John, Kevin, and Viral on the back end there for answering your questions. And with that concludes today's TechNet Live meeting. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. And our audience